Hello everyone and welcome to my Roadhog guide. Roadhog is one of the few tanks in Overwatch that helps facilitate this poke spam style of gameplay. Most of Roadhog's value comes from his chain hook cooldown. Generally speaking, you want to be predicting where the most dangerous threats on the enemy team will set up and proactively position yourself to be able to contest those angles with your hook and be able to fall back if you fall under too much fire. Due to your lack of armor, lack of shields or barriers, and the inability to shoot while you use your tanking ability, playing cover on Roadhog is incredibly important. Playing natural cover also helps you avoid a lot of hard stuns and other debuffs that would otherwise ruin your day. Playing natural cover is doubly effective on Roadhog. You can use your hook and its various techniques to further isolate your hook target from their own teammates. You can use walls, corners, and doorways to position enemies out of LOS of their teammates. They have to traverse even more distance to get back to their team and or stay out of LOS of cooldowns or healing that would otherwise save them. A lot of times, being a frail poke tank, Roadhog cannot immediately contest the objective without getting CC'd and stunned and debuffed into oblivion. It's perfectly acceptable in these positions to continuously rotate around natural cover to get in position to pick off the most dangerous targets to you, and then push the objective with a number advantage. Roadhog can leverage his very long hook range to do this from fairly safe positions. It's also incredibly beneficial to play near angles where you can quickly change up your angle around small pieces of natural cover to make it incredibly difficult where exactly you will peek from to look for hooks. Peeking the exact same angle over and over again makes it very easy for your enemies to predict where you're going to peek from. It's also important to switch up your peek timing so it's even more difficult for your opponents to know exactly when you're going to peek. Roadhog is also quite unique in its ability to easily and efficiently take flanks. Most other tanks have to commit a lot of resources, whereas Roadhog can just quickly pop to a flank, throw out a very long hook, and just immediately turn the fight in his favor if he gets a pick. Just be careful doing this, as you will leave your team without a tank for potentially an extended period of time, so you have to make sure your timing is down very well if you decide to do this. What you're generally looking for is to be either heavily advantaged or heavily disadvantaged when you go for plays like this. In advantaged states, you'll just cut down the map travel time that you have to traverse and just instantly be able to take angles where the enemies won't expect you to just immediately kill them while your team pressures on the front line. And in disadvantaged states, you can often just look for awkward angles where you're not expected to try to get a pick to turn the fight in your favor. An example situation for like this is for when the enemy team pops multiple ultimates and your team has 0 ultimates in response. As Roadhog, it's also very important to watch the respawn timer on the enemy team, as well as what characters they have or potential swaps they make to know when you can extend to continue staggering the enemy team. Roadhog excels in not letting the enemy team ever take a fight because in principle he can get a pick every 6 seconds or so. If you know people are peeking too early, or they don't have a comp that's very good at punishing you, you can often afford to play very aggressive and look for early intro picks for your team to easily win fights. Roadhog's primary fire, or the scrap gun, is best described as a shotgun. It features 4 central projectiles that have fairly tight spread even out to longer ranges, but its damage alone is fairly mediocre. There are also many peripheral projectiles, which cause the gun to have extreme damage at closer ranges. Keep in mind that this weapon is projectile, and you will have to lead your shots out to more extended ranges. This gun is mostly used in tandem with Roadhog's hook. It's also fairly decent at chipping down tanks at extended ranges, but don't expect to do too much damage to squishies at any more distance than about 10 meters. Ammo conservation with this gun is incredibly important. Make sure you're fully loaded before you take engagements, and make sure you always have at least 1 ammo left in the gun before you go for a hook, so you don't hook someone in and do effectively 0 damage to them. It can be perfectly okay, especially in 1v1 situations, to conserve your ammo until you get within a closer range so you can do maximum damage with your gun. It's perfectly okay just to shoot the tank when you don't have hook with this weapon. It still does moderate damage to tank even at longer ranges, and taking engagements without hook at long range with this gun will cause you to take way more damage than you deal and force out a ton of unnecessary resources from your team. Roadhog's damage mitigation ability, Take a Breather, offers moderate damage resist as well as self heal. This allows Roadhog to be semi-independent of his supports for extended period of times, unlike some other tanks that require more healing, more consistent healing, I should say. You generally speaking do not want to be using this ability to heal off small amounts of damage. You need to be saving it for large bursts of damage or a lot of sustained fire, which would otherwise waste a lot of your support's attention to keep you alive. It can be okay to use this cooldown when you have a lot of downtime to get extra ult charge, or to use it sometimes mid-fight to take some pressure off your supports so they're allowed to either pocket your DPS or deal damage themselves. Pigpen is yet another one of Roadhog's abilities. This ability is mostly used in conjunction with his hook to deal extra damage as well as slow down. The vast majority of the time you're going to be throwing this cooldown around a corner, so it's hard to destroy, and pulling people through it to maximize your damage with your hook combination. Just be aware that if you stop people roughly above the center of the pigpen, it will cause them to slightly pop up in the air. As long as you're aware of this, it shouldn't mess up your aim. It's very valuable to pull bulkier DPS such as May and Reaper into this, so you're actually able to one-shot them. And it's also very valuable to pull tanks into this cooldown so they slow down and make your subsequent follow-up shots much easier to land. Very occasionally, I will throw this in doorways or paths I'm retreating through to make it harder for enemies to chase me without either destroying the pig pen first or walking over it and doing damage to themselves. Very, very occasionally, I'll throw this in the middle of the enemy team just to get a bit of extra ult charge, as well as sometimes throwing on high grounds when my teammates are engaged in 1v1s that I can't help them in otherwise. Chain Hook, or just Hook for short, is Roadhog's most important cooldown by far. Without this cooldown, Roadhog would be really a terrible character. Roadhog's hook effectively grants him the second longest effective range of any tank in the roster, second only to Sigma. There are a few other tanks, such as Orisa or Matra, that have some spam projectile that they can occasionally influence a fight with at longer distances, but these are just far too inconsistent to consistently change the fight. The power of Hog is in his ability to leverage his up to 20-meter long hook to get a pick at extended ranges and turn the fight in his team's favor. Generally speaking, you want to be using the maximum effective range of hook to make yourself as hard to punish as possible, and also giving the enemy as few opportunities to escape back to their team as possible as well. Hook features quite a few techniques as well. Executing these techniques properly will significantly up your Roadhog game. Fundamentally, all these techniques are pretty much the same. You have to ensure that you're inputting whatever inputs you're making as the hook is reeling back. If you input it too early, these hook techniques will either not work or be very inconsistent depending on the exact map geometry. By far, the most important hook technique is the turn hook. When you turn your crosshair as the hook again is being reeled in, you'll reposition your hook target roughly 70 degrees to the side where you're aiming after you turn. This is obviously very useful at moving people around corners or into doorways or further into the open so your teammates have better LOS than them. Generally speaking, turning people around corners makes your hook even more effective because it's almost a guaranteed way to block the enemy team's LOS on your hook target, which makes it functionally impossible for a lot of characters to heal, use cooldowns on, or matrix, stuff along those lines, the hook target. You can also body block your hook target to make it even more difficult for them to escape back to their team. This is obviously conditional, and you have to make sure you're healthy in order to do this, but it's definitely very important to be able to do this consistently. If you're standing beside a very sharp corner, or a corner maybe where there's an object in the way of you being able to just directly pull someone through it, you often will need to turn your camera first to the opposite side of where you intend to bring your hook target, and then quickly to the side where you intend to stop the hook. This allows you, again, to round these more sharp corners. The next technique is the jump hook. This is pretty much just what it sounds like. You just have to input jump as your hook is being reeled in, and you can pull people onto the same elevation you're on. This is obviously quite useful on maps with a lot of high ground where you can set up on high ground on defense, such as Launch Point Gibraltar or Blizzard World Second Point. Just keep in mind that there needs to be a minimum distance that people are away from you for you to be able to pull them up. If they're roughly directly below you, there's absolutely no way you can pull them onto the high ground with you. So in this instance, it's best to crouch and shoot them in the head for maximum damage. The final primary technique Hog has is the slingshot. This is basically when you just hit your ultimate button as a hook's being reeled in, and it will break the hook but preserve its momentum. You can use this often with just the turn tech to launch people in specific directions and just fling them across the map, and then continue ulting them to push them even further away, either into your team or just off the map in general. This is definitely not as useful as the previous two techs, but it is something you can keep in mind. There are a few other techniques you can do with Roadhog, such as stalling with your hook by flipping your camera constantly or getting people stuck on map geometry, but these are generally speaking not nearly as useful even as the slingshot. Roadhog's ultimate, Whole Hog, deals an immense amount of damage and knockback. Unlike his primary fire, his ultimate is hit scan, which can allow you to occasionally use his ultimate to kill lowish health targets from farther away distances more consistently. Generally speaking, you're going to be wanting to solo ult tanks, especially in enclosed areas, so they cannot get pushed away. Jamming people in enclosed rooms or corners completely negates the knockback, and even allows you to more easily headshot people, which the ult is capable of doing to deal even more damage. Occasionally, you can use this ult to deny certain ultimates, such as Nano Blade or Kitsune Rush, by popping it as soon as they use those ultimates. But generally speaking, this isn't the most valuable way of using it because Roadhog builds ult fairly slowly and generally speaking grants the enemy team a lot of ult charge in return. Occasionally, you can also set up very cool plays where you push sometimes one or multiple people off the map to get very easy insta kills, and very occasionally as well, you can use it just to push people off the objective to get guaranteed caps. Roadhog's perks are quite straightforward. For his minor perks, Hog Toss is currently likely the better option. The burst damage is more valuable in Roadhog majority of the time compared to the extra ammo you receive when landing a hook with Scrap Hook. Especially against tanks, you really need the burst because a lot of tanks have a lot of ways of denying your scrap gun value. So just getting more value out of your hook initially is generally speaking more valuable. This is incredibly important, especially against tanks that have a lot of armor, ways of eating your damage like Diva's Defense Matrix, or a lot of shield like Reinhardt. I definitely don't think Scrap Hook is a bad perk, it's just not quite as valuable at the moment. It's worth mentioning that you should not be using Scrap Hook if you find yourself running out of ammo every time you go for a hook. You need to practice your ammo management if you want to be successful on this character. And relying on a perk that you won't have for a fair amount of the game is not the correct option in dealing with this. Invigorate's the obvious major perk to choose, pretty much every single time. Movement speed is completely overpowered in Overwatch, and being able to control it by yourself is incredibly powerful too, especially on an otherwise completely immobile tank. Fun fact, Roadhog is actually the only tank in the entire game to have no mobility options without perks. Being able just to run away and disengage more quickly is incredibly powerful in Roadhog. That being said, being able to chase people down in 1v1s or in situations where you can't get punished, and even come back from the respawn room more quickly should you die is incredibly valuable. Just be aware in these situations that you shouldn't be burning all your breather, and you really should be allowing it to recharge to full by the time you actually need it for the actual engagement. As a slight aside, I think hydrogen exposure may have some value in 6v6, should the most stay in the game. The teams in 6v6 generally play more stacked, so you're more able to consistently get heal value from the perk, and you're also able to heal your second tank as well as the rest of your team from just random group spam, and charge your ult more quickly. This being said, Invigorate's probably still a great choice in 6v6, but it's much more team comp dependent as well as map dependent. I think Roadhog struggles the most in the Brawl Tank matchup, overall of course. Brawl Tanks often have a lot of natural HP, a lot of natural armor, which Roadhog struggles to deal damage against, as well as often multiple ways of blocking hook, and often mobility to help them close the distance. Even if Roadhog hooks these characters, they're often able to survive the initial burst as well as some follow-up, and just block the rest of the damage, or just start consistently doing a lot of damage to Hog if he's overextended. They also can speed the fight up and give Roadhog very few, if any, chances to actually go for hooks on their backline. While dive tanks are generally speaking much faster and mobile than brawl tanks, they often have inconsistent or just generally speaking low damage, as well as inconsistent or lower tankiness than brawl tanks in general. Overall, Roadhog can either completely ignore a lot of dive tanks and have multiple opportunities to try to hook their backline in engagements, or just hook the dive tanks over and over again to force all their resources and make it incredibly difficult for them and their team to walk up. I think Roadhog has the best time with dive tanks in general, generally speaking because he has the most options when playing against them and can often take multiple opportunities to get picks or just deal a ton of damage to the dive tanks to ruin their engagements. Hog's matchup into poke tanks is overall fairly neutral. Hog's advantages is that he can instantly swing fights should he land a hook. Even hooking the tank is generally speaking a ton of value, especially against the overall frailer poke tanks. Hog also does immense damage consistently at close range, as long as your aim is fairly decent. Other poke tanks cannot keep up with a close range fight with Hog. Unfortunately for Hog, other poke tanks have barriers that bypass hard stuns, as well as any other debuffs that are thrown their way, should they be aimed correctly. And they also deal much more consistent damage at range, whereas Hog is much more feast or famine as a character. Hog, however, can roughly match or exceed the range of other poke tanks as long as he has his hook available. There's definitely a lot of odd play potential because other poke tanks are also fairly frail compared to the other tanks in the game. Although this is a valuable general tool, this is incredibly important against tanks. You should not be using your hook against tanks point blank unless you're guaranteeing a one shot on them or trying to deny one of their cooldowns. For example, if Doomfist blocks in your face, or you're trying to predict that Winston's about to jump away, these are acceptable times to use your hook even if you cannot one-shot them. You should be trying to pay attention to the cooldowns the enemy tank uses to see if you need to use your hook if you're not point blank. For example, if Doomfist uses both of his mobility cooldowns, you can walk into him, shoot him, bait out his block, and hook him out of his block for an easy kill afterwards. Also incredibly important to track cooldowns or barrier resources on tanks in particular because they often have many ways of blocking your hook. If you just continuously hook into shields because you're not tracking them, you're making a major mistake that's completely avoidable if you just pay more attention to cooldowns. Despite being a dive tank, I think D.Va overall can trade very favorable into Roadhog. She's very good at stalling Hog with her long matrix, as well as her fairly flexible mobility options and her immense amount of armor. She also does fairly consistent burst just with her primary fire, especially because she doesn't have to reload. And she does even greater bursts with her micro missiles should they be available. She's also quite threatening and functionally almost able to one-shot Hog's teammates if he misses too many hooks, unlike a lot of other dive tanks. Unfortunately for Hog, D.Va's range is quite poor and she has no method of blocking hook except by playing natural cover. Her mobility is also quite slow, so as long as your teammates are positioned decently well, they can often kite D.Va's engages as long as she isn't heavily supported. If you play either far enough away from D.Va around cover so that you can pull people out of her matrix or just play out of her flight plus matrix range, you can still kill people in front of D.Va. Generally speaking, in this matchup, however, I try to hard focus the diva with my team's help and try to get her off the field out of mech as soon as possible. It can be quite difficult to get consistent kills as long as she's online, especially because a lot of maps aren't very conducive to flanking or playing super far away from her, especially if you're forced on the objective. It's also worth mentioning that if D.Va tries to remech in front of your face, you can immediately pop ult and just destroy her mech immediately because she cannot take knockback while she's being remeched. Doomfist is generally speaking not too problematic for Hog unless you're fighting against a very good Doomfist or your team stacks too much or splits too much. Doomfist, like D.Va, has incredible burst, especially because Hog is fairly easy to power his empowered punch off of. This obviously allows a Doomfist multiple opportunities to try to one-shot your backline or farm a ton of overhealth off of slamming big groups and going for big punches that way. Always pay attention to Doomfist cooldowns, primarily his mobility cooldowns, his punch and slam. When he has no mobility available, just continuously shoot him to force out his block and then hook him out of his block for an easier time killing him. Do not chase Doomfist around the map. He obviously has way more mobility than you do, and his cooldowns on a very short cycle. You often will give up your positioning if you decide to chase the Doom across your map and allow your front line to get run over by turning back from him consistently. Hazard is somewhat a combination of brawl and dive in how you should approach the matchup. If you ignore the Hazard too often, he can do a lot of damage to you, fairly quickly close the distance, and disrupt your hooks with multiple cooldowns. On the other hand, if he ignores you, you can often just target his backline and try to go for one shots as long as you're positioned far enough away so your team can't get traded in return easily. Both Hazard's Leap Slash and his Wall have the ability to boop you and ruin your hook combo. When he has both these cooldowns, you're probably going to be forced to focus him to force out a lot of his resources before you can try to trade his backline. If the Hazard attempts to set up early on an off angle and wait for his cooldowns to come back online, you have the ability to try to trade his backline as long as your team isn't too close, because his mobility is not super great and he cannot cover much distance with his leap at one time. Like a lot of other tanks, Hazard can only mitigate damage in one direction. So if you have the opportunity, you can hook him, try to walk around his backside to off angle him from your team and do maximum damage by shooting his back, or force him to block in your direction and allow your team to do maximum damage to his back. It's also worth mentioning that Hazard's wall only requires 3 shots in a melee to completely break alone. Hazard alone, generally speaking, cannot put too much kill pressure on Hog, but he can easily force out your vape if you're playing too far away from cover. Also keep in mind that his wall can block off doorways and potentially kill you similar to a Mei wall. Junker Queen can be quite tricky for Hog to play into in certain matchups. Her knife is a very effective disruptive tool. Her shout can quickly allow her and her teammates to close the distance between you and your team. Her axe can give her a lot of sustain against you, and her shotgun has much better range than yours does, and her character model is significantly smaller than yours. In neutral, she can do a ton of damage to you if you're not careful, and constantly pull you away from cover and out of LOS of your supports, and potentially off high ground, which is absolutely disastrous if you're not careful. Obviously, your ult's also very strong against Hog, because it does pretty decent damage and applies an anti-effect that's very difficult for Hog to survive against in certain situations. Fortunately for you, if you manage to hook Queen, she's very vulnerable due to her very low HP and long cooldown on her shout. Her self-sustain is not enough to help her survive against Hog as long as you're hitting your shots and hook her into your trap at close range. Against Queen, I generally try to hard focus her to force out her shout and then continuously hook her into my trap when she doesn't have shout to get the pick. Obviously, in certain situations, you can just ignore the Queen if, for example, she uses her shout too early and just pick off her backline, but I find it much more consistent to try to hook the Queen and just blow her up. She's probably the most vulnerable tank to just getting killed outright by Hog as long as you're landing your shots. A small tip: when Queen throws her knife into you, because she doesn't have to reel it back immediately, do not throw a hook, because she can easily reactively mess up your hook aim and completely deny your value with the cooldown. Just wait for her to reel it in before you try to go for a hook. It's also quite possible to stop Junker Queen's ult reactively as long as you're playing decently far away from her. You can either hook her out of her rampage, which occasionally will cause you to get purple depending on the exact distance, and you can also pop your ult to just push her away from you and your teammates. And now on to everyone's favorite tank matchup, Malga. Malga obviously does an insane amount of damage against Hog if you just sit in the open and allow him to farm you. Also, he's functionally indestructible when he uses his cardiac overdrive and just runs into you and just farms you. It's incredibly important not to peek Malga when he uses his overdrive unless he's debuffed in some way. When you peek him, you give him a very easy source to heal off of, which makes him basically indestructible. The key to this matchup is just completely LOS him when he uses his overdrive. His overrun's also quite annoying to play into because it's basically impossible to hook him out of it, and Hog is a very easy slam target. This matchup will really stress your fundamentals on Hog because if you play in the open and allow Malga to sit close to mid-range and have no cover, he'll just farm you indefinitely, force out all your resources, and force you to just run away. Malga isn't a character that you're going to have a tough time playing in the objective against, just because he can stat check you so hard. Against Malga, I'm generally speaking playing the medium to long range angle, trying to hook him through a lot of open space, and trying to force out his cooldowns so I can more easily walk forward before the fight actually starts. If Malga runs into with a brawl comp, it's going to be very difficult to win if he just immediately closes his distance, so you're kind of forced to force out his cooldowns early, as long as he's playing with a good comp. Due to a recent balance change, however, Malga's overdrive is significantly worse because it no longer grants his teammates damage reduction. This makes him significantly worse at just ferrying his entire team into a brawl against you. Once you've forced out his overdrive, you can either look to hard focus Malga or hook his backline. This is more so dependent on the team composition differences. For example, if you have methods of easily blowing up the Malga like an An or a Zen, you can just hard focus a Malga. But if your backline isn't too powerful against him, you can just bait out his cooldowns and then try to hook his backline. One of the saving graces in this matchup is that Malga effectively needs permanent LOS of the enemy tank to get value the vast majority of the time. Whereas you can just peek for a second or so, immediately get value, and then immediately take cover afterwards. In cage fight, you can either just blow him up if he doesn't have overdrive, or shoot the cage itself with your whole hog if he does have overdrive. He's actually borderline impossible to kill, even with your ult, as long as he has overdrive, because he'll get pushed too far away if you do maximum damage. Exactly what you want to do in his ult is also somewhat dependent on whose supports has LOS on the ult as well. Orisa is another pretty tricky matchup for Roadhog to play into. Orisa effectively has 3 methods of blocking your hook, and easily outsustains you in the close range brawl. She also has fairly annoying poke at distance, which can force you off angles if you're not playing close enough to cover. Against Orisa, she's really similar to how you play against Malga. Just don't let her get close with all of her cooldowns because you will get forced away or just immediately die as a result. One difference in the matchup is that Orisa has significantly worse mobility than Malga, so she can't close the distance as easily, but she has 3 methods of stopping your hook. So it's much easier just to completely ignore the Orisa and attempt to attack her backline. Sometimes against Orisa, you can just momentarily stare at them with your hook online, but obviously not use your hook against them, and they'll instinctively use their cooldowns to try to block your hook. Since they have so many cooldowns, they'll often just do this so they don't accidentally get hooked across the map. Though this is probably very old news at this point, you can just counter ult Orisa when she decides to ult close to you. Your ult still does significantly high amounts of damage, even through her fortify and armor, and can still kill her in just a few seconds. Ramatra is probably the easiest brawl tank for Hog to play into. His only way of blocking your hook is on a very lengthy cooldown, and his shield does not last for very long on the map either. His damage per second is also not that great in either form. His staff form does significantly higher damage, especially because Hog's hitbox is large, and his head hitbox is especially large. Just try not to peek in the open when Ramatra is using his staff against you. Ramatra's Nemesis form is almost completely a joke to you. Its damage per second is very low. You can probably heal off the entire thing with just your breather and just immediately kill him after it expires. And because his character model expands in size, he's an exceptionally easy hook target, and he does no damage when he blocks. This will easily allow you to hook him out of position, try to turn him around a corner, and walk behind him to just blow him up. Alternatively, you can just look to hard focus Ramatra's backline because he's not much of a threat to you. If he spends too much time in his Omnic form trying to be a threat to you, your consistency at turning the fight over range is way higher than Ramatra's is. And if he attempts to close the distance fast with his Nemesis form, you can consistently reposition him and force him to continuously block or just immediately die as a result. You can use your ult situationally to just push Ramatra ult away, but a lot of times you can just outright kill him when he ults. Reinhardt can be either a very easy matchup or a very oppressive matchup, depending on the map and team compositions on both teams. On maps where Rein's very easy to ignore, such as maps with very large high grounds, Roadhog can easily just continuously pick off his backline and there's very little Rein can do. Conversely, on maps that are very linear with close sight lines, Rein can instantly charge into Roadhog and his team, force him off the objective, and just block every single hook Roadhog goes for, and just stall him out with his immense shield barrier. Roadhog only does okay shield break alone, and without a team of other damage sources, it can take Roadhog quite a long time to break Rein's shield. Fortunately though, on most maps, this isn't too much of an issue. You can, generally speaking, just stay out of Rein's hammer range and just look to spam his shield down and then try to hook someone in his backline if they overextend beyond his shield. Just be careful you don't get too close because Rein also has a lot of armor and can easily just swing on you as long as he's within his support's LOS and force you just to run far away. As long as you're spacing well in general, you can look to free hook his backline if they're playing on different elevations or on different angles in Rein, and you won't have to worry about his charge too much. You can look to hook Rein out of his charge or fire strikes. It's very difficult for Rein to consistently, reactively stop his charge to bait your hook when he charges, and it's actually impossible for him to throw up his shield when he uses fire strike. Against Shatter, just make sure you're on a different angle than your team and try not to let him get a pin off the map because this is generally speaking the only way Rein's going to be able to consistently kill you when he solo shatters you. If you get solo shattered, it's almost always not a big problem because your team can help you. And if he shatters your team, you can always just hook him away from your team and just damage dump him so he can't continuously walk forward. In the hog mirror, you pretty much always want to try to bait out the enemy's hog's hook. You don't want him to farm your backline, and this is the most consistent way of doing it. When the enemy hog uses his hook and misses, you need to react as soon as possible to either try to punish him or punish someone on his backline. Without hook, and with proper positioning, Hog's going to have a hard time consistently punishing you for trying to hook someone when he doesn't have hook available. As is the case in general, you really want to be playing further angles to try to maximize the value you get out of hooking people across the map, but this is especially effective against Hog because he is limited to no mobility and his tanking resource is very easy to interrupt. There's a common saying that says you should never hook first. This is only partially true. You can hook first all the time in team fights when you hook the enemy hog into your team, and you can also hook first in 1v1s as long as the enemy hog is killable. The caveat is that hooking first in the hog 1v1 when he isn't killable will pretty much get you killed every single time. Generally speaking, you want to be shooting them down to when they're about 200-ish HP, waiting till they use breather, and then hooking them out of breather and following up with a consistent high damage shot to guarantee the elimination. In the hog mirror especially, you always want to be playing near death pits while you deny the enemy hog the ability to play near them, so you always threaten the one shot on the enemy hog while he cannot do the same to you consistently. Sigma is a fairly even matchup until you start playing against very good Sigmas, though this is exceptionally rare. Sigma can, in theory, block every single hook you go for with his reactive shield, can stun you out of your breather, and deny a lot of your damage with his kinetic grasp. Sigma can also consistently spam you out, whereas your poke without hook is much less consistent. Sigma ult is also a big problem against Hog and his team, because Hog is very easy to farm ult off of. And now, thanks to recent-ish balance changes, Gravitic Flux completely ignores any sort of damage reduction, so holding Breather will not give you the 40% damage reduction any longer. Fortunately for you, Sigma's shield has a fairly low HP resource, so it's fairly easy to burn out. It's also quite slow, so if you hook Sigma's teammates, it can be very difficult for him to reactively shield them. Your range, as long as you have hook, is roughly the same as Sigma's, so you can also quite easily pull him across the map if he steps just a meter or two too close. When Sigma uses Rock or Grasp in the open, they're both fairly slow cooldowns and pretty easy hook targets as well. Hooking Sigma out of Grasp pretty much insta-kills them. Your maximum damage is also significantly higher than Sigma's. If you ever manage to pull Sigma close to you, or get close to Sigma in other ways, you can often just damage dump them and just kill them even with Grasp. When you use your ultimate against Sigma, pretty much always guarantee that you have your hook online. Sigma's barrier can give him enough time to get pushed away by your ult. His grasp can obviously nullify 2 to 3 seconds of it, and his rock can also give him time to get away from the immense amount of damage. Sigma's hitbox is also fairly small, so unless he has literally no cooldowns and no shield, he can often just ride away as long as he has anything available to stop some damage. Winston's another tank that probably won't give Hog much trouble in the vast majority of circumstances. He can be semi-difficult to deal with on offense on some dive-centered maps, but otherwise, you can just hard focus the Winston and give him a really hard time. In any other circumstance, you can easily frontline against the Winston, force out all of his cooldowns, or just kill him outright. Obviously, in general, Winston should not be attacking the tank, but you're an especially poor target for Winston to attack unless it's like a 1v5 because of your self-heal and high natural HP. He's basically completely wasting his time if he ever decides to frontline against you. There's a good amount of flexibility in this matchup because Winston's burst is also not super impressive compared to some other dive tanks. You can often get a lot of value from just hooking his teammates while the Winston engages if you predict he's just going to use his bubble anyways to block the hook. When Winston uses his ult, you can counter pop your ult and just push him away. Occasionally, you can just jam him in a corner and kill him because it only takes roughly a second and a half to kill him even with his 1000 plus HP. The Wrecking Ball matchup is quite similar to the Winston matchup in that you can either hard focus him or pretty much completely ignore him, but in principle, it's easier to hard focus the ball because he doesn't have a barrier to block your hook. Similar to Winston, I like hooking the ball if he engages too early or tries to stay around for too long without his cooldowns to easily kill him. Otherwise, I just try to hook his teammates whenever he goes for an engagement because his damage is not that great burst-wise. Against Ball, you just have to be careful he doesn't boop you off high ground, for example, or in the middle of his team where you take a lot of damage, force out all your resources, or just die as a result. Minefield generally shouldn't be too threatening to you because of your immense amount of HP and self-heal and damage resistance on your self-heal. When the fight is over, and the mines are still around, you can walk into them either to build your own ult charge with your breather, or allow your supports to build their ultimate more quickly as well. The Zarya matchup can go either way in my opinion. Zarya has significantly more medium range, consistent damage than Hog does, and her bubbles can either save her or her teammates from your hook. Hog is also quite easy to get charge off of in the vast majority of scenarios. And unironically, Zarya's right clicks can be quite disruptive to you and your hook combo if she consistently spams them at you. It's really quite annoying. Fortunately for Hog, your close range damage is roughly the same as Zarya's max charge damage, and your hook also outranges Zarya's maximum beam range. If you get close to Zarya and just run her over, you can immediately win against her. Or you could just play outside of her effective range, hook her into your team when she wastes a bubble, shoot the next bubble, and just blow her up as a result. It's also, generally speaking, worth shooting the hook target even if they get bubbled, if they die afterwards as a result.
Even if the Zarya gets max charge off the one bubble she uses to save her teammates, it's worth giving her 45 charge to immediately get a pick and swing the fight in your favor. Roadhog also, generally speaking, has enough tankiness to survive some of Zarya's even high charge beam focus, as long as you don't get antied as well. Whole Hog is actually quite good against Zarya because her bubbles are pretty much wholly ineffective against it because it does damage over time rather than one burst of damage. You can occasionally counter ult Grav if you or your teammates are at risk dying from the Zarya alone. Because of her limited range, if you just push her away, you can often save yourself or your teammates if they're not getting shot by anyone else in the Grav. If you want to get very good at Hog, you have to make yourself as difficult to read as possible, and therefore make your intentions as difficult to read as possible. You also need to be very good at reading both the macro and micro decisions the enemy team makes if you want to punish them consistently with Hook. Knowing the enemy team characters, their overall comp playstyle, and the map can give you a lot of information as to where people will peek from macro-wise as Hog. Micro-wise, you should be paying attention to the enemy players' movement, their cooldown usage, as well as how they peak in regards to their reload and their overall peak timing when looking to punish people as Hog. More specifically, in terms of macro, you should be looking to see what kind of composition the enemy team is running. Vaguely speaking, if they're running roughly brawl, dive, or poke, and knowing what characters they have on the team exactly will let you know what pathing they're likely to take at the beginning of fights, which allows you to pre-aim these positions. For example, a Reaper is very likely to play in very small enclosed areas where he can utilize his range, whereas an Ashe is likely going to set up on high ground and watch far angles where she can't easily get contested. In addition to this, perhaps a Reaper is being played in a dive composition, and you know he's going to wait for his tank to engage in order to engage himself. So you can just preemptively be looking at where you're expecting the Reaper to teleport to. Whereas maybe the Ashe is being played with a more poke-heavy composition, so you can react accordingly by knowing which lanes of pressure she's going to look for to best maximize the amount of pressure she can output with her team. You really want to be looking to punish rotations through choke points with Hog. This not only makes hooks easier to land, but it also is when people are going to be caught the most off guard. Very often, you can let the tank walk through a choke point and attempt to pick off anyone that attempts to follow their tank in. Commonly, especially as you rank up, people won't just stack directly with their tank, and you'll have to use the fact that the tank is walking in at a certain timing to look at a different angle than the tank and attempt to hook someone in this timing. This is especially important in the non-brawl matchup. If you can predict the overall game plan of the enemy team, as well as the game plans of its individual members, you often can set yourself up for very easy punishes or very easy hooks just by understanding what the enemy team wants to do. This is obviously incredibly useful in neutral fights, but it's also very important ult fights where you can shut down someone that has an ultimate early for your team and just instantly win the fight off of that alone. By understanding the macro of these situations, you set yourself up to more easily utilize micro decisions to land more hooks. Though the micro is the flashy part of landing hooks, the macro will allow you to leverage your micro decision making to more consistently land hooks. Usually, you want to be minimizing the time between throwing a hook and peeking a corner to give your opponents the minimum amount of time to react to your hook and dodge it. Good players can make themselves very difficult to hit if they know the hook is coming. Very often, you can preemptively throw a hook before even turning a corner if you know where people are going to be positioned beforehand. In order to do this, you can just jiggle peek around corners to scout for the enemy team's positioning before you even throw a hook. This gives you the additional benefit of baiting the enemy team into thinking you're backing off a piece of cover, when in reality, you're just slightly backing off a corner and just throwing a hook momentarily afterwards. Peeking people like this often will scare them to spamming their cooldowns on you, and is by far Roadhog's most effective way to bait out otherwise dangerous cooldowns on them. When you jiggle peek correctly and they spam cooldowns towards you, you'll either be safe behind cover even if they land, or they'll just completely miss you, depending on the exact cooldown. And of course, if you bait mobility cooldowns in this way, you're buying your team a lot of space to work with for no cost to yourself. When your opponents are themselves playing close to cover or occasionally peeking from cover to shoot, you should try to learn their timings of these things so you can preemptively hook the corner they continuously peek on. Some things make this very obvious. For example, some characters like Junkrat have very slow rate of fire weapons, and it's very easy to time your hook with their peak timing. Another good example of this is Sojourn. While Sojourn's primary fire has a very fast fire rate, her main value comes from her railgun, and if you notice when she's charged, you can often predict when she's going to peek to look to shoot someone on your team. In addition to this, you can often pre-hook certain angles where you expect people to be based off of sound effects or the projectiles that emanate from their gun. For example, you can use the orientation of whatever projectiles are being fired, as well as the understanding of the map and the character that's firing them to predict where they're going to be playing and throw a hook in that direction. It's probably the most obvious example of being able to mask your intentions on Hog. Being able to accurately flick is very valuable. You can act as if you're engaged with someone else, but truly be focusing on whoever your hook target is. Quickly flick your crosshair to the hook target before they expect it and catch a ton of people off guard in this way. This is not only useful for the obvious fact that you can secure easier picks this way, but by feigning your engagement on a certain target, except your hook target, you can often still do damage to them with your scrap gun and force out cooldowns this way, or just by staring at them. If you do this correctly, you will get a pick in addition to forcing out cooldowns or doing a lot of damage to whoever you're feigning your attention towards. Obviously, it's most consistent to do this against tanks, as they're fairly easy to hit even without too much attention being placed onto them. It's also very valuable to effectively be able to track people through walls as Hog. The easiest way to do this is to install wall hacks. For legal reasons, that was obviously a joke. And again, for obvious legal reasons, I do not use wall hacks, nor do I condone the use of them. But seriously, being able to track the movement speed of certain characters through walls is immensely valuable in Hog. It's very possible to predict when people are going to peek just by knowing their movement speed and effectively tracking them through walls based on their movement speed and the direction of travel. You can often preemptively throw hooks to where they're going to peek so they effectively peek straight into a hook. As an added bonus, pulling this off successfully will often just instantly tilt whoever you hook. Hog is actually quite good at ruining the mental of your opponents and is probably his biggest strength in a competitive environment. Anyways, you can often bait people into extending in a linear fashion by forcing damage on yourself and acting as if you're backing off an angle. This is probably the most reliable method of effectively following people through walls. You can also use your teammates' engagements as distractions to predict when people are going to extend through doorways to attempt to punish whoever they are fighting with. Successfully using Hog's gun, even without hook available, is also very beneficial. Due to your very high HP pool and slow rate of fire, you can often just mirror the movement of your opponents and just allow them to walk in your crosshair. There's no reason to rush your mechanics with Hog, especially in 1v1 situations, because you have a lot of HP to work with. When you're actively engaged in combat with someone, you can wait for them to make their movement more predictable, for example by using a movement cooldown, to line up shots more easily and consistently. In these positions, conserving ammo is incredibly important. Alright, and I think that's going to be just about all. If anyone's made it this far into the video, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it'll be useful for you in the future. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section, but otherwise, good luck and have a good day. I also do offer coaching, especially on Hog, so if anyone's interested, feel free to let me know. Thank you.